Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Jane Curtis, a senior partner at Aon and the First Lady President of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. Gosh, that seems like a long time ago. It's my pleasure as chair to welcome you all to this final instalment of the Presidential Speaker Series before the summer break, as part of the IFoA's 2021 Thought Leadership Programme. Now, this series has been very generously sponsored by Hong Kong-based IFoA fellow, Dr. Patrick Poon, and thanks to his kind support, we have been able to host the entire series free of charge to members and non-members. At the last count, we were expecting around 100 people to tune in to today's webinar, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all, wherever you are tuning in from. Now, I'm really delighted to be acting as chair today on behalf of your usual host, immediate past President Tan Suee Chieh, who is himself participating in the panel today. Most of you will be aware of the renewed emphasis on thought leadership at the IFoA, led by Suee Chieh since the turn of the year. Throughout his presidential year, he's advocated for thought leadership to be brought to the foreground of the IFoA once more, in line with the vision, skills, mindsets, and domains, or as colloquially referred to as the VSMD strategy, in order to reposition the profession at the centre of the key societal debates. In doing so, we hope that the profession is able to cut through the noise, add to the debate, and move the conversation forward, and build the IFoA's reputation as an authority so that we can execute our public interest duties and contribute to the solutions of society's biggest challenges. Now, today's event allows us to reflect on the core message which has been at the heart of the IFoA's Thought Leadership Programme: how we continue with the cultural transformation of the profession so that it encourages members of the IFoA to widen skill sets and diversify mindsets to help bring our vision of a transformed IFoA and profession to life. Over the course of the programme today, a number of renowned individuals have shared their insight and expertise, discussing issues such as the personal qualities necessary to navigate the changes unleashed by the digital revolution, the leadership and intellectual frameworks necessary to make progress in the solving of wicked systemic and sustainability challenges of our era, and the mindsets and values required to undertake cultural and organisational transformation. Today's event provides us with a timely opportunity to reflect on the last of these points, with senior actuaries involved with the profession, both pre and post-merger of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by fellow past presidents Ronnie Bowie, Paul Thornton, and Suee Chieh, as well as Sally Bridgeland, the first management board chair post-merger. They will reflect on the progress the profession has made in the last few years, the drivers for change in the years ahead, and the steps actuaries will need to take in order to remain relevant and influential. Drawing on their extensive experience and vast contributions to the profession over the last few decades, this panel is going to debate why actuaries need to adapt to move into wider areas, and how the IFoA's VSMD strategy can support this reinvention. So now that I've provided you with the context for the discussion today, a few words about our speakers. So Paul Thornton, he was president of the Institute of Actuaries from 1998 to 2000 and of the International Actuarial Association in 2010. He was also chair of the Association of Consulting Actuaries and chairman of the Pensions Committee of what is now the European Association of Actuaries. And he received a President's Award from the Society of Actuaries in the USA in 1999 for his contribution to international cooperation in the actuarial profession. Until June 2006, Paul was with Watson Wyatt, where he was actuary to a number of major pension schemes. He served on the worldwide board of directors from November 2000 until January 2006, and was the senior partner of Watson Wyatt LLP from May 2001 until July 2005. He then branched out, and he was then chairman of the pensions team at Gazelle Corporate Finance Limited, member of the With Profits Committee of Prudential Assurance, and strategic advisor to data mining specialist Decisions, as well as a non-executive director of the life company of BGI. And in May 2007, he provided an independent report to the Minister for Pensions Reform in the UK on a review of 9 government-sponsored pensions institutions. Now on to Sally, who's led anything but a traditional career. Sally is an actuary with pensions and investment experience as an advisor, trustee, and non-executive director. She's currently a non-executive director at Insurer Royal London, at Impacts Asset Management, Local Pensions Partnership Limited, where she chairs its FCA regulated investment company, Pension Insurance Corporation, and Royal and Son Alliance. Until recently, Sally was a pension trustee for both Nest Corporation and the Lloyds Bank pension funds, having previously been Chief Executive Officer of the BP Pension Scheme. She spent 20 years with Aon as a consultant and in research and innovation. Sally serves in a voluntary capacity as a member of the Royal Society's Advisory Committee on Maths Education and chairs the Strategic Advisory Board for the Centre for Mathematical Cognition at Loughborough University. She is an honorary group captain with 601 Squadron. Sally was the first Lady Master of the Worshipful Company of Actuaries from 2016 and was named as a Role Model of the Year in the 2018 Women in Pensions Awards by Professional Pensions. So on to Suee Chieh. So Tan Suee Chieh is the immediate past president of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. He's also a past president of the Life Insurance Association of Singapore and the Actuarial Society of Malaysia. From 2013 to 2017, he was the Group Chief Executive at NTUC Enterprise, the holding entity of the NTUC Social Enterprises Cooperatives in Singapore. The group has businesses in retail, food and beverage, financial services, education and training services, elder care services and property. From 2007 to 2013, he was the Chief Executive of NTUC Income, a composite cooperative insurer and one of the largest insurance businesses in Singapore. Between 2003 and 2006, he was President Asia Pacific of the SHL Group Limited, a British psychometric and psychological consultancy firm. From 1981 for 20 years, he was with the Prudential Group and held several senior positions, including Actuary of Prudential Malaysia, Chief Executive of Prudential Singapore, and Regional Managing Director, Established Markets of Prudential Corporation, Asia. And last but not least, our final panelist today, Ronnie Bowie. So Ronnie was Hymans Robertson's senior partner for very many years. He joined the firm in 1980. And Ronnie once joked to me, he said, graduated, joined consultancy, still there. A really impressive CV. But he's been a very impressive character, and he's led the firm to its current position of being considered as the UK's leading independent actuarial investment advisor. Ronnie was president of the Faculty of Actuaries from 2008 to 9 and was a driving force behind its merger with the Institute of Actuaries, becoming the first president of the combined Institute and Faculty of Actuaries in 2010. He's chairman of the NatWest Pension Fund, chair of the Prudential Assurance Company, chair of the University of Dundee, a board member of the Prince and Princess of Wales Hospice, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So an incredibly impressive panel with very wide, diverse experiences, all moving on from traditional roles to do something else with their actuarial skill sets. Now, in terms of the format, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to make a brief opening statement on their perspective of how the profession has evolved over the last few years before we head into a more detailed panel discussion. I will then open up questions to the floor, and you can submit a question at any time via the online Q&A function on Zoom, and I would encourage you all to do so. So, Paul, turning to you first, how do you think the ambitious vision we have today for the future of our profession differs from 20 years ago?
Well, I think the 20 years ago, there was a major strategic review, which we call Vision and Values, and there are quite a lot of similarities with the current vision that Suee Chieh has been leading. I think the driving force 20 years ago was concern about jobs for actuaries and wondering where the traditional areas of insurance and pensions were going, and where actuaries would be employed in the future. So I think the kind of the origins of the desire to look at the future was slightly different. I think also the profession was beginning to take itself quite seriously in terms of thinking about the public interest and acting in the public interest. Obviously, that's continued since. But I think that over the 20 years, my sense from where I sit is things have moved on a bit. I think the profession realizes that the world is changing very fast, and it needs to adapt to a changing world and be ready to engage with the world as it's developing. And I think it also sees the importance of playing as full a role as possible in making the world a better place, which is a slightly bigger concept than acting in the public interest. I think it's a more ambitious view of what actuaries can and should be trying to do. So very succinctly, I think that's there are quite a lot of similarities in the aims to move into wider fields and engage with people outside the actuarial profession and enable actuaries to have broader careers and so on. So superficially, I think there's a lot of similarity with what we were trying to do 20 years ago. But I think the kind of worldview that underlies it has come on quite a lot. That would do for starters from me.
That would do for starters for you. But you did make a comment when we were preparing for the session about the actuarial profession probably being unique.
Yes, well, I think I mean there are sort of three key points that I'd sort of make about what I think of the actuarial profession, and I think one is that it, compared with experts and other professions, I think it's in a unique position because actuaries have a long-term outlook. I mean, that's the history of the profession, is to look at long-term institutions and long-term problems. Actuaries understand risk. They're generally speaking mathematicians or scientifically trained, so they do understand risk. And they're very numerate, and actually quite a small proportion of the total population of the world is actually numerate. An even smaller proportion is capable of doing the sort of analysis of risks that actuaries do. And then all of that is coupled with the fact that we have a very strong tradition of ethics and being a professional body and being proud of acting in the public interest and trying to make the world a better place. So I think those three things together are very strong. You can contrast them if you take the global financial crisis 10 years ago. The banking profession was where all the problems were. Sorry, the banking industry was where all the problems were, not the insurance industry or the pensions industry. The pensions industry was the victim. The insurance industry survived it because of the very careful management. The banking industry was where the problems were. And I think you can link that to the lack of a strong banking professional body that was actually setting ethics for people doing the banking. Whereas I think actuaries just naturally were following a strong code of ethics. So I think that's a very key attribute of the profession we shouldn't lose sight of, and we should definitely build on.
Yeah, no, I was hoping you would bring that, and I'm sure we'll get some questions on that later. So, sure. Sally, now as I said when I introduced your CV, your actual career has been quite different from most. It's certainly been adventurous, moving in very different directions many times over the period since I've known you, which is quite a long time now. And would you like to say a little bit about the journey you've been on and why you've been successful in what you have taken on?
Thanks, Jane. And yes, I think I tend to describe myself as being born a round peg in a square hole, and that I was born a girl good at maths at a time when it wasn't fashionable for women to be good at maths, and to a certain extent it's still true today. But certainly 35 years ago, when I started as an actuarial trainee, on a bad day, it did feel like I wasn't really the idea of either the client or the partner's idea of what an actuarial consultant should look like. And you can let that get you down, or you can go to where you're feeling more useful. And so in a way, my career path followed the same philosophy of becoming an actuary in the first place, faced with the choice of doing a PhD and delving deeper into a particular area of maths, or going out into the wide world and finding some problems where I could use that maths. That's what drove me to become an actuary in the first place. And I was continually searching for areas that needed a bit of sorting out. And in the mid-90s, that was around how we use technology, how we embraced that, how we got more efficient. After that, I moved into the investment area, where there were an awful lot of things linking back between investments and the liabilities, so liability-driven investments. And then moved to BP, where they needed somebody who understood the investment side of things and the pension side of things. It just felt like a natural progression. And now, as a non-executive, including life insurance and general insurance, I've now got the full set of actuarial disciplines. But the important thing there is you're enjoying those different perspectives. So, why do I think I've been successful in that? It fundamentally goes to what made me a good mathematician in the first place, which was that curiosity, that adaptability, that ability to look at the bigger problem and look at the different perspectives and use those perspectives to solve the problem. That really is what a pure mathematician to me is all about. And that's what I try and do. And the most important thing in that is, to Paul's point, not many people out there are that numerous. Not many people out there can talk to the people who are doing the modeling and understand really what's the point, what's the so what about doing the modeling, but then draw back and say, how do we use that? What do we do about that? So I see myself in maths is all about translating problems. As an actuary, I think we've got great skills for translating situations, but really importantly now working as part of teams, an included part of teams, rather than trying to conquer disciplines and make them our own in quite a protective way, which was certainly, when I was on council and Paul was president and then Ronnie was president, it was a bit divide and conquer and make these areas our own, rather than be important ingredients as part of other people's teams.
And if you were just giving one tip, what characterizes all of us on the panel today is having moved from what was perhaps quite traditional sort of consulting sort of approaches, we've all doing non-executive work in a completely different field from what we started from. So, and a lot of people ask me, how have you had the courage to do that, to translate across like that? Would you just have a minute to just give a tip to someone who's contemplating that?
I think to me, it builds on the point that Paul made about risk and understanding risk. Businesses now need to understand risk. In the past, it's been, maybe having risk as a separate part of the equation, rather than integrating, thinking about risk, so that the hope for the best but plan for the worst kind of mentalities that most businesses have to have. If you're sitting as a non-executive, you can see whether the executive have got they tend to be more positive or they tend to be more negative, and encourage them to get that balance right. If I look at I've done work on risk and risk matrices for a charity, for the Nuclear Liabilities Fund, for the Royal Air Force, of a pension scheme of a bank, for BP PLC, all of that stuff. Building in their culture and their perspectives by listening to what they do can help them understand risk in a way that works for them. And that's where I think actuaries really have a lot to add to all businesses.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sally. So Chieh, coming to you now. Now, during your term as president, you've been on an absolute mission to challenge our vision of the future actuary. You've acknowledged we've done well in the past, for which the past presidents are grateful for that acknowledgement, but we need to push on to make a real difference. So what do you see now as the main priorities at this time, and what do you want to see change if we're to move forward with confidence?
What I say is probably not very original. If you look at the history of all the presidential addresses and the strategic vision of 2000, yeah, which is called 2020 actually. Ronnie in his speech to the faculty of actuaries talked about courage, but he used the word boldness, and Reddington used the word imagination, and that is what we really need. And I think the greatest priority for us today as a profession is the diversity of mindsets. Diversity of mindsets, yeah. And we have been strong in our traditional mindsets, as Reddington said, on accuracy and cautiousness and reticence, and they are absolutely important in many roles we play. But you and I would agree that in a world of digital and innovation, those are not very helpful. You need adaptation, you need a growth mindset, you need curiosity, you need experimentation. And that is where our strategy started. Yeah. So our strategy started with concern about jobs. I can still picture Marjorie and John talking about data science, about digital, and that's we but concern about the roles we have. Yeah, that's how it started. So if you the most important priority is mindsets. Yeah, and then there's another grouping of characteristics which has to do with radical uncertainty and the systemic challenges we see around us, and has to do with an approach which is systemic, which requires to have courage, imagination, and of course judgment. Yeah. So I think our mission at a conceptual level is the diversity of mindsets, not just our quintessential mindsets of accuracy and reticence and cautiousness, but also the more innovative mindsets of curiosity, adaptability, and a growth mindset, and a more systemic mindset of courage, imagination, and judgment. Yeah. So when we first started, we were concerned about jobs, or I was. Yeah, it's about skills and domains, the wider field strategy. But it was very apparent that it's not just about skills and domains. It's about the mindset of people going to the business, going to outside our traditional. The mindset is important, but of course, with the impact of COVID-19 and also the background zeitgeist which were changing on climate risk and biodiversity loss, there was increasing concern about the sustainability of our systems, right? And that gives us a shift to another gear, which is about the mindset which is need to be systemic. Yeah, which in other words, the problem is not about the ship which is sailing and making sure the ship sails well, is whether the ship is sailing in the right direction, or if it's sinking. There's no point polishing the machinery and making sure it works. And that is really not about accuracy. It's about taking up and look at a big picture, whether we are sailing in the right direction. And that spoke to the public interest part of the profession powerfully, especially with the impact of COVID-19. So at a conceptual level, I think our biggest priority is a shift, diversifying our mindsets. Yeah, only then we could make sure that we could do well in our workplace in a digital world, but also to speak to our public purpose. Yeah, and that public purpose is not just about COVID-19. It's about pensions. It's about regulation, and all that. And all that requires some degree of courage to speak to. So now and then it comes to our vision, right? So at a conceptual level, it must be about relevance, impact, and influence, right, at our workplace and society at large. And I would cite what Paul said about our unique lens. Yeah, our unique lens is one where we claim that we have firstly a public interest, but we are also a risk professional making financial sense of the future. And if that is true, we have to ask the question that whatever things we do, we've got to ask the question whether it's sustainable. It's not a question of whether it's accurate. It's whether it's very sustainable and serving public interest. So I think the debate has opened up, and we got to do that at a conceptual level. And in terms of priorities, which is probably more operational, because the culture of profession is about how we think, how we behave, and how we act. But there's also a body called the IFoA, yeah, which actually is the voice of the actuaries, or the actual voice. And that institution needs also to respond, right, culturally, in terms of governance and also in terms of capability. So I think we have made progress, but because there's the medium in which we could execute a lot of the professional interests, and I think there's still some work to do.
Mm-hmm. There is, and you've raised an awful lot of issues there, which will come back, I think, into the main when we can sort of have an open discussion with the whole panel, because I feel anxious. We need to get Ronnie an opportunity to speak now. Mm-hmm. So, and you've come last, which is a bit unfair, because often the rest of the panel have said it all. But building on what they've actually said, what advice would you give us to as individuals?
Okay. Thanks, Jane. Well, you can listen to presidents and past presidents as they wring their hands about the prospects for the profession and think, oh gosh, the glass is half empty. My view is the glass is more than half full. We should be proud to be actuaries, as Paul said, in those areas during the financial crisis, in those areas where actuaries had a strong influence. Those activities came through the crisis much more strongly than in areas where actuaries weren't active. So I think we often underestimate how influential we are and how much our influence can improve the confidence of consumers. So we should be proud of what we've achieved. And we are expanding into new areas. So 4 or 5 years ago, I was amazed to discover that the second largest employer of actuarial students in Australia was a data science business. There are hundreds of actuaries, literally hundreds of actuaries engaged in banking in South Africa. And the finance director of NatWest came to NatWest from South Africa. And she was quite scared when she arrived at NatWest and found that she didn't have any actuaries overseeing the output of the models, assuring her on the quality of the models, assuring her that the risks were being properly managed. So there is a market need for actuaries. It's just that not all of the market realizes that it needs actuaries, and actuaries are quite reticent about moving into those areas. One of the things I remember as a president, coming from a pensions and investment background, but going to the Life Conference and the General Insurance Conference and all the other conferences, was I was struck by how much more there was in common across all the different areas than there was different. We underestimate how transferable our skills are. And so if we understand that, as Suee said, my encouragement to all actuaries is to be bold, but individually and as a profession. If I think back on my own career, the biggest leaps my profession made, my professional life made forward, was when I took risks. Just kind of steady stuff. It was when we took risks. I mean, there were a few scary moments along the way when those risks were taken, but we had the confidence that if that particular venture didn't work out, there were plenty of other ventures that would. So we shouldn't be afraid to fail. And I think somehow our mindset as actuaries often makes us not want to take any risk of failing. Risks can be managed, but not all risks can be made to zero. And the last thing, it's both about individual actuaries being bold, but also about the institute and faculty being bold. And perhaps the greatest advances that the profession can make into new areas will be the peripheral people, the Sallys, the me's, the other people who've taken a risk and find themselves as the only actuary in an enterprise. In Aon, there are dozens and dozens, hundreds of you to act as a support network. Out in a data science business, if you're the first actuary, there's no support network. And I would encourage the profession to think about those pioneers within the profession and make sure that they're getting the personalized support that they need, just in the way that we're moving to a world of personalized medicine. So be proud and be bold.
Words which I can certainly stand by as well. So thank you so much for all setting the scene and providing that additional context to today's discussion. So we're now going to move into the discussion part of the event, where we're going to look to sort of dive a bit deeper into some of the points that you've all touched on. We've got plenty of questions coming in. So please do keep them coming in on the Q&A, and I'll try and ask them as we go along. The ones we've seen already, I think, are similar to the sorts of questions I'm now going to ask the panel. and just get their views on. So so perhaps Ronnie, coming to you. So how well do you think the profession has actually developed in recent years, and what is your score out of 10 for how the profession has evolved? And do you think, I might come to Paul with his sort of slight international hat on in that moment to comment secondly, is have we kept pace with the other actuarial associations around the world, or do you think we've got a bit more to do in that area as the IFoA?
Well, I'll give a score of 8 out of 10 for the profession, because I think that the developments that have taken place have kept pace with. I don't envy the people who have to continuously revise the syllabus, and we know, and it's true of actuarial science as it is true of medicine, that by the time somebody graduates or qualifies, half of what they learned is already out of date. So I think the profession's shift to lifetime learning and putting the onus on individuals to continuously learn and develop is the right thing. I think that there's a limit to what the profession can do. I wonder whether we as individuals have really embraced that concept of lifetime learning and personal responsibility as much as we have. We can't be spoon-fed for a 40-year career, but I think the profession has done everything it can. But I think that where it could have got 2 out of 10 is that I'm not sure the profession really has supported the people in the periphery as much as they could. For people who are outside mainstream actuarial activities, the professional body often begins to seem irrelevant, and I think that's what would have given it an extra 2 from 10, to the extra 2 out of 10.
Paul, did you want to add anything in terms of what you've seen internationally?
Well, I think internationally, I think the institutes and now the institute and faculty has always been a mover and shaker on the international scene, and it goes back a long way. You know, when the actual profession was just getting going in the 1850s, there were a handful of actuaries around the world. I think at that time it was primarily Russia, France, and the US, and already the Institute of Actuaries was engaging with them, and it was in on the very beginnings of the International Actuarial Association. Well, the International Actuarial Association carried on for many years as an organizer of international colloquia every 4 years typically. But in 1998, which is actually the period when I was president, it reformatted itself, restructured into effectively an association of associations. And that was a hugely important step when, again, the UK profession was very instrumental in bringing those changes about. The Canadian profession also was. So I think there's always been a strong belief in international cooperation and collaboration with the other actuarial professional bodies. And there's a huge amount to be gained from that, as well as to be contributed. You know, I think we've exported our experience and knowledge of how to deal with regulators and how to develop sophisticated solvency models and everything else. And we've helped developing countries acquire those skills less painfully than they would do it on their own. I think that's been a very kind of generous, if you like, approach of ours, helping other professions around the world. But we've also learned a huge amount. I mean, Ronnie was touching on actuaries getting involved and taking risks in new areas. Well, the Australians were the first to do this in a big way, mainly because they changed the tax system for their pension system, which meant that jobs rapidly disappeared in traditional pensions actuarial work, and the actuaries had to find something else to do. So they branched out into areas of climate and electricity supply and all kinds of new areas. And I think we learned from their experience of what actuaries could do in non-traditional areas. So it's been mutually beneficial. I think it's hugely important that we're strongly involved in international activities.
Yeah, I would echo that. Just before I come to Chieh and Sally, Ronnie, you touched on the banking, and I know that the South Africans have made huge inroads into banking and with actuaries. So, what do you think we need to change here, if we can, to make that happen here, where it's routinely we are at the core of what's going on?
I think it'll be down to individuals. I think there is, if we take the NatWest example, there's a finance director there who is absolutely open to it. I think there's a role for the institute and faculty to work with the people there to figure out what is, how can we adapt the supply so that it fits that need. But already there are actuaries in NatWest. I can speak about that because I'm very familiar with it. There are actuaries in NatWest who started in pensions or started in a derivatives trading desk who are actually moving into other areas. So my expectation is that in 10 years' time, there will actually be actuaries doing the same kind of work in British banks as there already are in South Africa. I wonder, though, whether there are some strategic and tactical things we could do to accelerate that. But I'm optimistic that in 10 years' time, this will have come, particularly now that we're turning out actuaries with a banking module to their qualification, which is an import from South Africa, which is another great example of the international collaboration that Paul talked about.
Yeah.
Jane, can I jump in on just add a comment on that? Because I think the profession does indeed have an important part to play in facilitating these developments, because I think an individual, maybe they're doing a maths degree or science degree and they think the actuarial profession might be interesting, so they then set about finding a job, and it's the easiest way to find a job is to go to some firm that employs a lot of actuaries, which will typically be in the core areas of insurance and pensions. So that is definitely the easiest way to get your career started. And once you're in there, I mean, certainly in my lifetime, there's been a huge demand for actuaries doing those traditional core roles. So it's then a question of, is the individual an adventurous type that thinks they'd like to do something even more interesting? Or how do you get those actuaries that have gone into the core areas interested in moving into other areas? Do they need to? Or putting it another way, how do you get new recruits into the actuarial profession going into new areas from the outset? And that, I think that's quite a big challenge.
Yeah, no, and Sally wants to come in there, I can see.
Yeah, I think we've always focused on the profession as kind of the supply side, the supplies of actuaries, rather than necessarily the demand side. And I don't think we've necessarily made the most of the fact that we've now got different actuarial pathways, different qualifications, like certifications in risk management and the different steps that we now have that we didn't have when all of us were involved at the top of the profession. And so the question is it's not just about thinking about how the actuary progresses in their career, but it's how the non-actuary decides actually getting an actuarial qualification or module would strengthen what they're able to add. Wouldn't that be great if we had more people coming from outside saying, you know, that risk management qualification you do, I'd like to do that, please. Having not followed that path, that would be a real result for me. And it's very similar to the conversations that we're having at the Royal Society about mathematicians. You know, the focus on maths education is on educating mathematicians rather than educating everybody on being numerous and being comfortable with maths. And it's kind of, how do we make sure that everybody knows when an actuary would be helpful and when that kind of qualification would be useful, rather than focusing too much on this is actuarial work and this is what actuaries do. It's how can our skills be useful.
Suee Chieh was itching to get in, I think, with a comment.
I have things I want to respond to because partly because I'm in the preceding 2 years we are addressing all these issues, And Ronnie Bowie has the benefit of perspectives of 20 years, and he's probably right of seeing the glass as half full, more than half full. And I suppose I'm actually in the system looking out, yeah. So I probably see what we are capable of, and we can be capable of doing to really change, and there's so much more to do. So there are different perspectives, yeah. So I would have, in terms of rating, I'll give you my rating. So when I speak to people internationally, we look so good, you know. IFoA looks so good. There's so many stories you can tell, whether it's COVID-19 or whether it's our online exams and all the things we do, and the quality of the British qualification of with ethics and public interest, right? Which I do speak with passion, yeah, in different audiences. But internally, I think because we are in the system, I think it's good to be authentic and to talk about it. I think there's still a lot we can do. So my rating would be more like 5 or 6, yeah. So more like 5 or 6, but it's not a recognition of a lot of work to be done, work which has been done, and a lot of work to do, yeah. And one of the good indicators would be a group of very senior actuaries, yeah, who are disengaged with IFoA, approached me when I joined the presidency to feel that IFoA has sort of lost its way in a sense of influence, in a sense of speaking up, in a sense of being responsive to its membership. Yeah, because I've been out of IFoA for 15, 18 years. In my first 10 years when I was in Prudential UK, I was quite active as a student member and eventually as a fellow member. But I can see what they're saying, right? But actually, from outside in, looking in, we look actually quite good, and we should protect their reputation. But inside out, I think it will be a danger. It will be a danger to over-congratulate ourselves, because there's still a lot of work to do, and the threats are real. The threats are real, yeah. Mm-hmm. That's why we have. And the big issue is about mindsets, yeah. So the banking, I spoke to a number of actuaries in South Africa on the banking, and Ian Allen is one of the leading lights, and also the late Mahindra was also very instrumental in introducing a pathway to the fellowship in banking, which will come out next year in 2022. And I also spoke to the founders of Quantum Consulting in data science, right? But those, they have very unique ways of rising. For South Africa, the two chairmen of two big banks, one precursor was the Barclays Bank, and then there was another bank, it's Sunway or somebody bank. But the two chairmen, one of them was an actuary, the other one, they actually have great faith in the actuarial mindset, right? And that's jumpstart. So there are about 300 to 500 actuaries in South Africa. It's in hundreds who are actually working not in insurance part of the bank, but actually in a main bank itself on product and distribution and credit, which is a big difference. The actuaries in Australia were basically the roles in life insurance disappeared, so they got to find their roles, and they were able to transform. The VSMD actually took all this into account and realized the missing piece is for the skill set is the mindset piece, so that we got to promote the mindset. But we need to have a culture which embraces this. So we have a project called Project Moonshot, yeah, which actually is a learning change program of the VSMD. So it commits the institution IFoA to data science, to climate change, in terms of credentialization, and also the banking fellowship. But actually underpinning that is the attitude of ownership and responsibility, and the understanding of what the actuary skill sets can do. So we are encouraging optionality and modularization, right? So in many ways, if you look at Louise, right, our current president, she's a climate science and sustainability actuary, yeah. But there's no modules there. But of course, if you have module that it supports it, you can also think in terms of a data science actuary, a strategic actuary, a system thinking actuary, an epidemiologist actuary. Yeah, all these are very possible because they are very adjacent to our skill set. So there's a lot of things we could do as an institution, but on an individual level, we can also encourage individuals to go out and experiment and conquer new areas. And there are many actuaries in the fintech in UK and also in Southeast Asia. We need to bring them back to say that belong to the profession, right? And help us to create those communities. Otherwise, we'll lose them. So we got to redefine what is an actuary? I think many of us did not decide. Many of us decided to use our mathematical skills to be practical in a career which uses our skills and a rewarding career intellectually as well as financially. But we don't have to work in pensions. We don't have to work in life insurance, although they are very important roles. But there's a whole set of roles, right? So the IFoA needs to be able to open up, because the configuration of pensions and life business is going to change in the next 20 years. So we need to give our members the skill sets and the pathways and the support environment to new domains. But I think the key to it, as I come back to it earlier, is still the mindset piece now. And there's still, we need to get the consistency of message across, yeah, and the clarity of message, right? And how one generation goes to the next. And I talk about generation, I mean presidential team, yeah, and how we can keep the consistency of message so that it can actually flower. But as you said, Ronnie, the last 10 years, looking back, actually, you have done quite well, you know, in terms of, you look at general insurance, which started 25 years ago. But maybe it's the anxiety of the current generation, yeah, which makes sure, because in the moment we are complacent and think that we are doing well, I think that could be a danger. But on the issue of thought leadership and public interest, there was a lot of debates within council over the last 5 years. When I joined the council in 2017, I was never part of IFoA for the preceding 15, right? We wouldn't have got the climate proposals through. Luis was a big champion even at that time. But last year, it was a unanimous approval, and it was quite a strong worded proposal on climate risk, because the zeitgeist has changed. Yeah? The zeitgeist has changed a lot. And I think it's a good time for us to really respond to it. It's a great opportunity for the profession, in my view.
Yeah, it's Chieh, timing is everything, isn't it? Because you and I had a session where you outlined a lot of that to me. And you know what, Ronnie? That reminded me 10 years ago when we were doing the strategy back in 2010, when we were trying to achieve quite a lot of that, you know, in terms of looking at the careers that people could have and how we might develop the education. And we were really, really keen to go down that path, but the sense was that our fellow professionals just weren't ready for making that change. So do you think Suee is going to have more luck now? Do you think it's right, the timing?
I think it's the curse of every president who's only president for 1 year to want, cultural change takes a decade, but we're only president for 1 year. So we are doomed as presidents to bitter disappointment, because there's so much we want to do in that 1 year. And Jane, I think, we can look back to 10 years ago and say, well, we didn't achieve what we wanted to achieve 10 years ago, but we set the ball in motion. And we set the ball in motion such that when you get to a president like Tan Swie Chieh, who comes at a point with enthusiasm and energy, and the timing is right, then the ball is in motion, and Tan Swie Chieh can pick it up and run with it. So I think it's just, and there will be things you've done in your year, Tan Swie Chieh, that you think, oh gosh, I really wish that had progressed much better. But you'll be able to look back in 5 or 10 years' time and see that a subsequent president has picked up what you've done, and the timing's been right, and the people have been right, and then you've pushed on. So I think partly the reason I'm giving a bigger score than you are is that I've probably learned the lessons that there's only so much you can do in a year, but actually, with the benefit of hindsight, you can see that the seeds you sowed have flowered much later, perhaps, than you had hoped.
Mm-hmm. Sally, I think I just come to you. There's a question that's sort of come in from the floor, which I think might appeal to you, is whether confining ourselves to the financial world is part of the problem in encouraging actuaries to move into other sectors.
I think that's a really interesting question. And there's another question about whether we should try and regain our ownership of the making financial sense of the future catchphrase that we used to have. And the thought process I was going through on that was, how might that limit us? And the word financial was the one that was bothering me, because I think the thing that bound together everything that we were doing at the time that we had that catchphrase, making financial sense of future, was that it was all about financial stuff and financial risks. Whereas if you look at the world is moving towards a broader sense of what risk is about, risk and uncertainty. And it isn't just about financial, and sometimes it might be about translating non-financial risks, climate risks into financial risks, into a language that makes them easier to understand. So that's where I see what would I like the profession to be doing in 10, 20 years time. It would be helping people understand some of those risks in financial terms. But I'm not sure it's making financial sense. I still like our original in Latin motto of making certainty out of uncertainty. That's what I use when I'm explaining what actuaries do. It helps people understand what the uncertainty is and what risks are, and the difference between the two. And you know, to illustrate how broadly applicable that is, I was in a taxi last night wearing face masks with a rock star, an Oxford professor, and a US Air Force guy from the Pentagon, talking about risk, talking about latent risk, talking about active risk. It is something that everybody is interested in, and the fact that we have a disciplined, analytical, clear approach to thinking about that in the long term as well as the short term, I think is really valuable and a really translatable skill. So that was one of the other questions was from the audience was if you've got a boy or girl that's interested in joining the actuarial profession, what would you say to them? The world isn't going to get less risky. Having a transferable skill is going to become more and more important. It's not just about, as Jane, I'm sure you and I will both advise, to join a profession, because then when you go and have babies, you can come back because you'll always have that profession to fall back on. Everybody needs professions and acknowledged badges to fall back on. And I think ours are still the best badges in the world.
Yay. Does anyone else want to comment on what Sally said, or shall we just move on to pick up on the
I just have a very quick comment, partly and it has to do with the history of risk and uncertainty, right? And then introducing a concept, Knightian or radical uncertainty, and to do with the DNA of an actuary, right? I had this notion, and it has not been challenged, that many of us, 95% or 98% of us, throughout Malaysia, Singapore, Africa, India, UK, we chose to become actuary because someone told us, like to be a career advisor, to consider it because we are good in mathematics. Yeah, good in mathematics. And we could have chosen to be accounting, MBA and all that, but we chose mathematics to apply in a practical setting. Otherwise, you go to do physics and whatever, yeah, engineering. But practical setting, organizations, people, this. But we not chose. So that is the part about us. And the part about risk and uncertainty, I have the notion that actually when Pascal and John Morgan and all the famous actuaries of the past, for them, they were uncertainty, but they translate it into something which is modelable, which become risk distributions and things we can quantify. But actually, those were very systematic risks, linear risks, but nevertheless, the challenges were big. But now I think the world has become more interconnected, more complex. The risk has become non-stationary and non-linear. And so we are forced back to our toolbox again, to look at our toolbox, to widen. We are still attempting to make sense of the uncertainty, except that not using our traditional risk models, but there are other parts. And I can see the sprouting of the debates from Neil Cantor, from Nick Spencer, and different groups, and also some from a risk board, thinking about risk in a slightly different way. And that requires multidisciplinarity and dialogue, which Sally talks about engagement, about listening to other points of view from other areas. And that is a big jump for the profession. It's a big jump. And the jump is psychological and cultural. To be able to say that we don't have the answer and to listen and to integrate is a big jump. But that is a real cultural shift for us. And I think that we might have no choice if you want to unpack this problem, because our traditional toolkit of mathematical analysis might not be enough.
There's quite an interesting question there, commenting about should we be talking about risk or uncertainty? And I think it's a very good point, because we talk about risk as if that's something you just manage and you sort it out and you do something rational to deal with it. We've suddenly realized with the current pandemic that we're actually dealing with huge uncertainty, and we don't know what the risks are. Actually, we don't learn the lessons, do we? Because this was the same, there were some parallels with the HIV crisis years ago, and actuaries got quite heavily involved in that. And the real contribution the actuarial profession made at that stage was just revealing the total uncertainty about where this might all go and how bad it could be, the development of HIV and AIDS. And because of some of the terrifying projections that we produced, governments took action, and good results came about. And as we know now, the result was eventually we got on top of the crisis. But it's, I think that sometimes the major contribution we can make, and I think this is a good question that's been raised, is just actually pointing out the uncertainties. And it's not managing risk, it's actually modeling uncertainties. So possibly it's the training and understanding probabilities. Yeah. And if you go back to the very origins of the profession, I mean, it all started with people building mortality tables. That's nothing to do with financial risk. It wasn't even about running insurance companies originally. It was right at the beginning of that. But it was actually understanding what was happening to populations.
Yeah. So do we think that we as a profession have played a good role, an important role in helping sage on the pandemic? You mentioned mortality and the pandemic. Chieh, do you want to comment on the work the profession has been doing to try and be influential?
Yeah.
Without shouting from the rooftops.
Of course, we had a role, and it arose out of a messaging I had with Annette Spencer, who I believe is in the audience, about, I said, how come the SAGE people are not involving the actuaries, I said, and I think we agreed that we should write to them, and we wrote to them. And there was a number of conversations, and eventually Stuart and Colin spoke to the chief statistician, Sir Ian Diamond, plus somebody else, and a professor, and 5 of us, and eventually we were involved, and then they were working with the ONS and all that. But I suppose we were a bit reticent, I think. I'm outside looking in, right, to volunteer to serve. So we were involved in SAGE, and now they are still working quite closely with ONS, I believe, and there are quite a number of papers, and they rely on some of the work the actuaries responsible and ICAT do in some of the timing of the announcement, and was quoted by the Prime Minister in one instance, right? And we have seen, so that is something we should do. But this conversation was also about how we see ourselves, right? Because if we claim ourselves to be actuaries in a computational sense as technicians, then I think we can go with our life and be happy with it. But we claim ourselves to have a public interest purpose, and we claim ourselves to be risk professionals. If you're a risk professional, by implication, you've got to ensure that whatever you recommend must be sustainable in the long term. Yeah, I don't think anyone will argue with that. So anything we do in terms of modeling, any recommendations we make, it's not just within the system. You've got to check whether the system is sustainable. And the big change in the last 3 or 4 years, even before COVID-19 came, the bushfires in Australia, the hurricanes and the typhoons and the drought in California, and the melting of the polar caps were already very strong signals, and the tide was going to turn. But of course, COVID-19 gave it a big shock, right? Because it was a VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous event of a global order, right? Of a real global order, which was universally felt. And that actually set the change, right? But that, for me, gives us a great opportunity, right? Because if you think about risk, and then it points to the VSMD powerfully, right? Because it is, you really got to be integrative and be communicating with other disciplines, right? Whether it's epidemiologists, climate scientists, and I think also economists, right? There's a big debate going on now in the pensions area with Martin Wolf setting up, which is a continuation of the debate from Paul Collier about, we won't get sucked into that because we just had a major debate yesterday about, we can claim that we are doing it correctly, and I believe we are, but there are much wider issues, and the issues are economic arguments, purpose of the scheme, purpose of society, purpose of pension, and eventually what happens, right? So I think the mindset we need to adopt is that we can't claim that we have all the answers, because we don't, but we can have a seat on a table to say that we have this lens and let's talk about it. I think that is something we need to do.
So Sally, I saw you put your hand up there. And
I think, and then there are a few questions on this kind of area as well. And part of the question is, what is the role of the profession in supporting actuaries and supporting the use of actuarial skills in business? It goes to the 2 points out of 10 that Ronnie was talking about earlier. How can actuaries in the periphery be better supported? I've learned to be an extrovert, but I know most actuaries tend to be born introverts. They don't want to have to be selling their skills. They want the profession to be out there telling everybody how useful actuaries are. And, you know, this is a job for an actuary. We used to have a joke about, you know, you need the bat phone, you know, the bat, you know, Batman thing. This is a job for an actuary, kind of, which would just make it easier for Sage or whoever to say, oh, crikey, yes, actuaries, they're good at this stuff. We'll go to them. People still don't know. We're still a relatively small profession. People don't know what we're useful for. And if they've met an actuary, they might think that they're a specialist in a narrow field rather than have got those transferable skills. So I think there's more that the profession can be doing to trumpet that. And to a certain extent, I think when we moved our role from just from being about education and professionalism, you know, after the Morris Review, we didn't necessarily think, what can we be doing? What else can we be doing? Now that we've given up that bit, are there more things that we can be doing? Yes, we've got much more support for members, much more support for people debating different kinds of issues, but actually, are we being outward facing enough into the users of actuaries, the demand side rather than just the supply side?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to something that Ronnie said in his opening bit about being bold. And I know over the years, the profession has struggled in getting the right balance in terms of just how vocal to be on the issues of the day, fearing, you know, political, you know, tendencies or whatever. So I'm very interested, I'll come to Ronnie first, but very interested in what the rest of the panel think is, do we need to be more vocal to be influential? And if so, how should we go about it?
I'm just, Jane, I'm just trying to answer Andrew Smith's question about, you know, he's thinking back to when we were very influential on changing behaviours on AIDS. But here we are in climate risk, and we don't seem to be quite as influential. And what I was about to type was that when we've had our greatest success, we have often had one or two personalities who have actually taken the message out. So I've now, embarrassingly, I now can't remember, Stuart McDonald, sorry, I have now remembered, Stuart McDonald has been an absolute personality on COVID. I mean, he's been on you know, he's the only thing he hasn't been on is Question Time, I think, but he's been on almost every other media outlet. And good on him. He's had deep knowledge, and he's had a lovely way of explaining it that actually speaks to the populace. I remember when I was president, there was an EU ruling that men and women had to have the same car insurance rates. And actually, because it actually mattered to the population, and somebody, Inette, had given me a very good script to speak to. Actually, I was on several television programs and we got lots and lots of coverage. So I think we do need to nurture one or two people with deep knowledge in an area, for example, like climate change or whatever else, and really use them to get in front of the media, because that's when we have been our most effective. We've got all the data, we've got all the science, we've got all the evidence. We just need somebody like Sally to put her extrovert jumper on and go out there and really give it laldy. Is that an English? Is that a Scottish thing? Give it laldy, or is that a British thing? I can't remember.
Paul, did you want to add something?
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with that, and I think we need to be ready to step up. And it's great, that Stuart McDonald's done what he's done, but I think the reality is he had something that people wanted to hear about. He knew what he was talking about, and he had a message that people wanted to know. And if you look around, the universities have had an absolute field day with the pandemic, and lots of academics who would normally just be quietly beavering away without anybody even knowing they were there have risen to national importance because they've actually known what they're talking about and have had something useful to say. So I think being vocal is great, and having a good PR campaign is good, but actually you need to have something that you're really contributing to the national debate. That is what gets people's attention.
Yeah, and Paul, absolutely. You can't just do it as a sort of as just PR. It has to be deep. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. Our greatest success has been we've had an individual who has, or a group of individuals who have deep knowledge, but also that ability to connect with the public. That's when we're at our best and most influential.
Yeah.
Sally,
I think the other ingredient there is around it having no commercial gain. So that's when it's something where you're proud to see another actuary involved in that. They're not doing it to sell a product. They're just doing it because they understand this, and that knowledge is useful and helping make a dense subject more enlightened for everybody else. But I don't think it's either or. I think the kind of PR that I was talking about was not front page of the Daily Mail stuff. It was helping employers understand actuarial skills, general supportive, getting the environment better, but having a few individuals who are out there. So it's very similar to, I've been cycling in London since 1984. There are more cycle lanes. That PR, that making it safer is great. The individuals like, whether it's the Tour de France, our success in the Tour de France or the Olympics, there will be individuals who are actually waving the batons for cycling, but actually having the general environment better is something I think the professional body, we've got high expectations of that going forward.
Chieh, were you wanting to?
Yes, I do actually, about courage and boldness and speak up, and that happens at a number of levels. And I think we ought to make a distinction. There's the IFoA, the body. The profession is the membership, members. So how does IFoA help the membership? So I think let's make a distinction. So I think IFoA can be smarter and more responsive in commenting. But the issue is getting a view, and often we like to have a consensus view. And by definition, a consensus view is not going to be as radical or as potent as a view which is based on a certain point of view, right? So you can see what I'm getting at. But we need to be smart in positioning views by individuals and those which are policy. So that process is working through. So to be able, but I think the climate is also changing, allowing us to be bolder, because that helps people to be more responsive to the issues which are arising. So I found that over the last 3 years, we tend to descend to a common denominator. So if everyone agrees to it, then it's the average of all the views. And sometimes it can be influenced by commercial interests, whether it's the pension issues or it's the equity release mortgage or whatever. So it can be influenced by that. But you need some guys with an intellectual vision Yeah, I think maybe in 20, 30 years ago, we got senior guys in the center with an intellectual vision to hold the disparate views together and said, okay, we present this way. So, but that requires hard work, right? It's too much to expect executives to do it, right? And Jane, you were involved in the regulatory bit. You know, it's hard, yeah. So we need a diversity of skill sets and stature within the council, like people at the center, so that we can then spearhead the leadership. Then it's a question of culture, right? I'm overjoyed with Stuart's impact at Sage, in the Sun newspaper, in BBC, in Spectator, in Wall Street Journal, in South Africa newspapers, yeah, and CNN, right? But it's not entirely his work, and I think Stuart would agree to that. It's the work of a group called the Actuaries Response Group, and that group was formed outside IFoA, of which I was a member. Yeah. And we couldn't form it inside IFoA because it would take too long to form a group, and there's no process to form a group like that. And I'm not criticizing anyone in IFoA, but it's how it was. I was told it would take 4 weeks or 6 weeks to agree on the terms of reference. By the time of 4 to 6 weeks to agree on terms of reference, we have already launched 18 bulletins, right? But we did it that way, and I got tacit support within IFoA, and that was how it's done. So we got to, but I'm not saying that everything should be done that way. Yeah? So we need to have a skill set, because if the world is changing differently, there need to be understanding and a degree of latitude and forgiveness. And I still remember, and Stuart will back me up on this, on the week we were forming it, we got what we thought was a warning that we be careful, yeah, because they say that our approach must be evidence-based and be robust. But what evidence-based are we going to rely on? We need courage, imagination, and judgment. Yeah, and we got to do it with the actuaries code, in mindful, and off they went. But it could have easily gone wrong, right? It could have easily gone wrong. But they took a risk, and it sort of paid off, and that it led to quite a number of other changes which are connected. And Graham and I had a phrase to describe this. It is actually a clumsy solution. Wicked and complex problems don't have elegant solutions. That solutions are always clumsy, and we must have greater tolerance for clumsy solution. It's not about consistency or accuracy. Then the judgment has to come in. That requires leadership which is wise, to understand history, changes in the environment, and to make sure that people, but the council on the whole and leadership eventually were wise. They gave the blessing and said we should push on. But some of the initial stages was actually quite difficult.
Yeah.
So there's still a remaining issue to be, so how responsive we are. And that is a part of the work which is really behind closed doors, right? On how we could be more responsive in governance, and in culture, and also responding to the members' needs. Right? But it's a loose tight property, right? It is top down and also bottom up.
So one of the questions coming through, and I know that from my time, with doing the professional work, is the extent to which the big membership out there does fear change. A lot of what we talked about here is the need for change, the pace of change, accelerating it, and so forth. And a number of us have had courage to sort of go and try new things. So so there is this fear out there. So what I think would the panel say to those who fear the focus on effectively new domains, new areas that could lead to dilution of the profession's core, and whether that puts at risk that deep subject matter expertise that we particularly have in, say, mortality, but in other areas as well. So Paul, Sally?
No, I personally, I don't think there's too much risk involved in that. I mean, I just think there's so much momentum behind the mainstream areas. You need to nurture them and make sure that we continue in the core areas. But I don't think, however much effort we make, branching into new areas is really going to detract from that, unless we really mess things up. I think one of the questions that's come up actually is, shouldn't we be encouraging the mainstream actuarial employers to branch out into new areas? And I just don't think the world works like that. The the mainstream actuarial employers do what is commercially successful. And if that's doing core traditional pensions and insurance work, that's what they'll do. And that's what they'll employ actuaries for. They'll do a little bit of innovation around the edges if they think there's a potential new line of business they could develop. But I think the firms will do what they think's in their own best interest. And I don't think we can look to them to branch out.
That's interesting. Sally's
just,
nodding.
While I've got,
I think,
sorry, do you want to, while you've got the microphone, sorry, Paul wants to make an extra point.
I spotted another question in there about the role of the universities. And actually, you know, one of the key themes of Duncan Ferguson, my predecessor, and myself was engaging with the universities and helping them get actuarial modules going so they could start teaching parts of the actuarial syllabus. And in fact, we gave quite a lot of money to some of the universities to help them pay for the first lectureships. And then basically they were able to get going from there. Now, I think the wonderful thing about universities is their motivation is completely different. They're not commercially driven in the same way that actuarial employers are. And they're generally, academics are curious. They're interested in what other academics are doing and what's going on in other fields. So I think it's very fertile ground for spreading actuaries into other areas or getting actuaries involved in new areas. And I think that happens almost naturally within the university context in a way that it doesn't happen in the commercial world. So I think building good links with the universities is very important. At one stage, I was on an external advisory panel for the statistics department in Oxford, and which was one of the places where we helped them get starting teaching actuarial science. But there were people on that external panel from the military, from the pharmaceutical industry, from the Jenner Institute. All fields that statistics is useful in was represented. So the actuaries in the statistics department were getting exposed to all of that, and I think that it's really important that the profession is involved with the university system and takes advantage of the networking that enables.
Sally, I think you've probably got 2 or 3 points you can pick up on there.
Yeah, so I think in response to the original question, I think there's more risk in just focusing on the old areas, you know, the traditional areas, and not thinking about the breadth and how we cover the breadth. In terms of the roles of employers, I agree with Paul that it's less about the employers and more about if you're an individual actuary within an employer. You know, I didn't ask to get involved in BP PLC's risk framework. It's because I was doing that in my day job with the pension fund that we thought about, well, actually, how could we do that for the corporate and translate it up to that area? So you start in a role that's recognised. The point about the universities and the way that different organisations use their resources. In the armed forces, we've been talking about how, with the RAF, we've been talking about how we use the reserves, and the idea just sprung into my head about, well, if we ran an actuarial reserves facility where people could be seconded or used at times of crisis or when risks are being sorted out, how would that work? How could we do that? Is that an interesting form of continuing professional development that we could foster through technology or whatever, just to get greater exposure of actuaries to different situations and different employers and situations to actuaries? Wouldn't that be fantastic? So, and that is something that perhaps the profession could support. It's real life practical stuff where people can get different opportunities. And I think given that careers are looking very different now, how we work is looking very different, that is much more of a reality. And it responds to the question that would we be able to, can the non-financial services employers afford actuaries? Well, they can if they only get part of them. Bits of actuaries and bits of actuaries here and there. The brains and that side of it is the most important bit. But just making sure that at the right time they can access that kind of resource that would be brilliant.
Yeah, well, I'm going to come to each of you for a 1-minute wrap up in a moment, because this has gone amazingly quickly, this discussion. I just want to run a quick question past Ronnie, which kind of builds on some of that here, which has come from the floor, is do we think we need to reset the clock in terms of actuaries' expectations on what they can earn by way of pay, so that some of these non-traditional fields can afford us?
Pay is an obstacle to the expansion, and I mean the situation in Australia, where there was a shock which changed actuaries' expectations about pay, was a catalyst that I hope we won't get here, because that's hugely disruptive. My seeing into banks, even into the higher echelons of universities and into some other businesses, I don't think the pay at the top level is materially different in those organizations than it is in an insurance company or wherever else. So I think my impression is that actually you can get well paid if you're adding value.
Yeah.
So there may be a little bit of kind of, I could kind of get I'm in an organization, I'm in a consultancy or in an insurance company, and I've got a step, and I know that I'm going to do that, and it's all going to be nice. And it's much less certain in this other organization. But that's why you have to be bold, and that's why you have to be confident, and why you have to be proud of and self-confident in the value you can bring, because the pay structures I see even in engineering companies, which have been notoriously underpaid in Britain, are now, I've got 2 daughters who are engineers, and they're getting paid as much as actuaries. Mm. So I don't think, I think there's a worry about it, but I'm not sure that worry stands up to evidence. And just on, if I've got the floor for a second, Jane, just on that point, the new stuff and the traditional stuff aren't mutually exclusive. Hymans Robertson has 25 people in longevity. 5 of them are in the US, and they are going gangbusters because they're bringing British longevity techniques, which are way ahead of the rest of the world, to bear in the States. They are not new stuff, and expansion is not a mutually exclusive activity from the traditional stuff.
Well, thank you for that. So, moving very quickly on to wrap up, and you've got 1 minute max on this. Thank you very much for all the questions we've had for the floor. We've tried to bring them into the discussion and just keep it free flowing. So hopefully we've addressed quite a lot of the points that have come through. At the end of the session, if you can complete the feedback survey using the QR code that will be visible on screen, that would be brilliant. So I'm going to come to Chieh last, but Ronnie, it was the question that you said I can ask you, but I'm going to ask the others as well. So in a nutshell, what's your best and worst professional decision during your career?
The best professional decision was joining Hymans Robertson, which, because I hadn't done appropriate due diligence, was about to go bust when I joined it. And yet from that group of 6 people that I joined in 1980, it's a firm of 1,000 people today. Yeah. So, I mean, just we had nothing to, when I got there, I found that we had nothing to lose because we were going down the pan. So we just had to be innovative and bold. The worst professional decision I ever made was when the firm had got a bit bigger, we bought an IFA, which was riddled with pensions mis-selling. And there were 2 lessons from that. One is we had been naive about doing our due diligence. And secondly, culturally, this was a group of people who sat very ill with the kind of ethical trend of the actuaries. So it was both financially and culturally a dreadful fit. And I recognized after that culture was the most important thing to look out for in looking at any organization, whether to join it or to merge with it.
Thank you for that, Sally. Quickly.
So I think it's difficult to identify best and worst. Some of the things that I thought were worst at the time ended up being best with the benefit of hindsight, in that they were the ones that were the most risky, the ones where I thought, I'm really not suited to this. The culture isn't right. Difficult bosses, difficult situations, difficult people. People it's a real problem for mathematicians to have to deal with that kind of stuff. But actually, coming out the other side, some of those decisions to work in difficult, challenging areas are the ones where I've learnt the most and prepared me to actually think this is, 8 out of 10 is the new 10 out of 10. It doesn't matter if I can't get the last 2. Actually, what matters is I'm getting the 8 and contributing and helping move the organisation forward. That is the biggest lesson.
Good, thanks for that, Sally. And Paul?
Well, I think my best professional decision was joining the actuarial profession, because it suited me to a T, and I found my way into a really nice firm of like-minded people that I thoroughly enjoyed working with for many, many years. I sort of look back slightly and think there was an opportunity to get more involved with the investment side of the actuarial profession at one stage. And I didn't sort of completely devote myself to that because I was pretty busy doing mainstream stuff.
Yeah.
So
thank you for that. So Chieh, if you'd like to give your best and worst, and then I think you're going to say a few closing remarks about the Thought Leadership Programme, and then hand back to me to close.
Okay. Like Paul, I think joining the profession, the IFoA, was a decisive pivot in my life. But in terms of technical actual decision, it was a decision when I was in NTUC Income to move more of our reversionary bonus to terminal bonuses. But it was a difficult decision at the time. Nick Dumbrag and Graham Clay came to Singapore to help explain it. And it was against a very hostile public at the time. But it was the right decision. It was the best decision I made. Worst decision could be some decisions I took maybe too quickly in altering compensation agreements with distributors. So I became a target both in Malaysia and Singapore. But that turned out to be a good decision because I learned from my lessons. Yeah. So in that. But coming back to thought leadership, I have to thank Annette, who is in the audience, for being a partner, and of course Louise and Stephen for being part of the group as well. It has been a stimulating journey. I was just looking at the numbers this morning. I think about 9,000 to 10,000 attendee sessions. Yeah? So that would not be possible if there was no Zoom or there was no COVID-19. Right? So all this was made possible, and of course there was a sponsorship. So in terms of modules, we could talk about the actual innovation in the COVID-19, and they got about 3,000 attendees, 3,000 plus attendees, and that was a huge success with many thought leaders from inside the profession, academia, Sir Ian Diamond, David Spiker-Hacker, all came. It was quite a display of actuarial thought leadership at its best, right? So that was remarkable. The finance in public interest stood out for me because the conversations will go on to the next year. What Paul Collier and John Kay, as well Andy Holden and Louis Pryor, and also 4 actuaries, Ashok, Nico, Silver, and Lucy say, talk about what is the finance system delivering our public purpose. Yeah? So those 2 modules stood out for me. But as a whole, the whole journey began with digital, right? The digital, and then we had people like Ibarra and Andrew Scott to help individuals to navigate the changing world. That was the thinking under the behavioral series. But in the last 6 weeks, working with our own panelists and also with the speakers, in particular Hodgson's and David Brook, it suggests that actually everything what we are saying is correct. We need to move quite well into that space, right? One is about complexity. I don't think anyone would disagree there's complexity and speed. And the issue is systemic. Yeah? So we need to introduce some kind of systems thinking into our mindset and our skill set. And the second leg is about uncertainty in the future, and to do with futures. Right? And futures, there's nothing for you to use evidence. You need imagination, you need judgment, you need narratives, you need conversations. Right? And the third one, and I think Sally spoke to it in a number of other forums, about engagement with other disciplines, engagement with other disciplines, and what Horston's called the missing mental capacities, about consciousness of our purpose, right? Yesterday, I saw a display of that in a private meeting, Actuaries for Transformational Change, 2 senior actuaries. The job is not to articulate their position. The job is for them to listen to the other person well enough that the other person agree that he has listened. Yeah? And I think this is a big thing, because the issues, the answers are not going to lie in our own head. It's going to rely on a diversity of opinions. And whether we could host that as a profession, I think it will be interesting to see. So I see that the thought leadership have given an opportunity for us. And I think we cannot be too complacent. We enjoy this, we learn from it, but I think that the opportunity unleashed gives us to reposition the profession as one which is anchored on public purpose, on sustainability, and on speaking up with some courage, with some imagination, and with some judgment. So on a reflection, I think it has been a wonderful journey with many wonderful colleagues.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much for that, Chieh. And it is time to draw today's event to a close. So I want to thank everyone for their attendance and participation. I'd particularly like to thank Ronnie, Sally, Paul, and Chieh for everything that they've done, for all the work behind the scenes as well. Just a plug, though, to continue all the fantastic work that Chieh has just been talking about. The Thought Leadership Programme is going to take a short break over the summer, but it's going to return in September with a vengeance, with a new series, which is the Road to Glasgow, and it's the IFoA Sustainability Thought Leadership Series, which is going to run throughout the autumn in the run-up to COP26. So really do encourage, look at that great lineup of speakers there. I really encourage everyone to look out for further information as we finalise the plans for this, and I do hope that you will be able to join us for what should be a fascinating series. So that concludes today's event, and thank you so much for joining us, and goodbye.